in a way, what we are in crisis to is a crisis of creativity in the way in which information is presented, right? I think in a way, the formats of the legacy media became irrelevant.
Welcome to a bonus edition of Diving into the Discourse. With the presidential election coming up, we thought we'd have a special edition of Diving into the Discourse to explore some of the issues that arrived during the election and in its aftermath. Today, I'm your host, Carmen Ramos Chandler, and joining me today is José Luis Benavides, a professor of journalism here at California State University, Northridge, and whose specialty is media studies. So welcome, José Luis.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So we did a press release about this topic in the past, and I just want to explore the media's responsibility because everybody and their brother is covering the presidential race like a horse race. So what is the media's responsibility historically and in today's environment with so many different types of means of getting information?
Well, the media responsibility is essential for the citizens of the country, right? Mm-hmm. In a way, media and journalism in general really are meant to be tools of citizens to get informed about what's going on in society, right? And elections are a keystone of that. And evidently, it's a point in which the citizens have a chance to have a choice and choose their leaders. So it's an essential process for a democratic society that we lived in. So the role of the media is essential in that regard, right?
But in recent years, when clicks and ratings have become so important, and even print media has an online presence now, are they truly covering the issues that are important to people, or are they covering issues that are important to politicians?
Well, you're highlighting one of the main problems, right, of today's media environment, legacy media. Mm-hmm. They were, until very recently, the only player in the game, right? Mm-hmm. So social media has been a big disruptor of this process, right? And we've seen that happening more clearly it was already during the election of Obama, the first election of Obama and the second election of Obama, but I think it was very clear in the first election of Donald Trump that social media had a really big impact on segments of the population who were only informed by what they were seeing in Facebook at the time, right? So since that moment, you will see a lot of distortions happening through the work of social media, which is really a new player, and it hasn't been properly regulated, especially in topics like this, right? When you are providing either information that is inaccurate or you are on purpose deceiving the public about what's going on, right? So there's a lot of noise, and that makes it difficult for people to make an informed decision, right? And that obviously puts legacy media, meaning what we knew as the newspapers and the television newscasts, et cetera, in a weird position because they need to compete with social media for that part of the business, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these operations really are also, they have to be operating as a business or at least as a self-sustaining venture, right? So it makes very difficult for them to compete with social media. And in many cases, people don't even pay attention to what these newspapers are saying, right?
As a former journalist, working journalist, I chose the profession because I wanted to have an impact on my community. Mm-hmm. I found knowledge is power, and if I can share as much knowledge as possible, I am empowering people. But if you narrow down something as important as who is going to be president or who is going to be the next U.S. senator for my state, it seems to me you're belittling or undermining the importance of that position.
Most people don't vote because of the content of a campaign, a presidential campaign. They vote with their gut. They vote triggered by an emotion. And I think that's very... people that run campaigns in politics, they're always trying to position these emotions right in front of whatever audience they're doing through advertising or through the kinds of issues that they are presenting to the public, right? So it is about liking a candidate or even liking if the candidate does any particular thing or behaves a certain way, right? That makes people think that that's the person that is going to be the best candidate for president. So a lot of these is not really, despite the fact that we think of it as a deliberative process in which people think about these and evaluate the platforms of these candidates and then make a decision. No, most of the time really is about an emotion, right? I like this candidate or I don't, and it boils down to that, which is a very problematic issue, especially for something that should be a democratic system.
What is the media's role in helping the consumer, I'm not saying voter now, the consumer distill the spin and the advertising to find out what it is they need to know so their gut can make an informed choice?
Well, I think like you said, most people that work as reporters, right, they're really compelled to work in journalism because they want to be of service to the community, right? You're providing a service to the community primarily with your reporting. You want to be as truthful, as accurate, and as comprehensive as you can, right? In the reporting that you do, you want to conduct yourself professionally, right? You don't want to be swayed by ideology, friendship, propaganda, etc., right? So you want to be as clean as you can, and as upfront as you can with your readers, with your viewers, etc. But obviously, reporters work within newsrooms that have different priorities depending on what organization is, right? And as you mentioned, in many cases, now these news organizations really are competing for clickability. They're competing for being watched, right? And it's really shameful to think, for example, that the most watched cable news channel is a channel that really doesn't have credibility as a news organization, is more like a propaganda organization of a particular party, right? But it's the most watched cable news operation in the nation, right? So the others have to mimic, or at least try to do something similar to get the kind of ratings that they need to continue operating as a business.
In this race to get ratings or the clicks, do you think, and it's not necessarily the reporters because they want to be reporters, they want to serve the community, but those above them are ignoring the issues of the quote-unquote common person. I find it interesting that I can turn on to Comedy Central and choose one of their shows and actually find a comedian doing a deep dive into how the candidates will impact, their policies will impact veterans, or mass flooding, or a train derailment. I never thought I'd be turning to a comedy channel to get in-depth coverage of issues that are important to me on the ground.
Comedy programs, I think, perform what cartoons or political cartoons played for print media, right? It's a form of communication that conveys probably important, significant information in a more digestible way, and probably in some cases with a clear political or ideological view, right? So that's why they could be very effective and very attractive to viewers, the same way that political cartoons were when they were doing properly, right? So people were connected to that. You feel better, you understand better and easier in a way a more complex issues. And you are absolutely right? I've seen shows of comedy shows that explain very complex issues, right? In a format that is engaging for the audience to watch, right? And you understand the basics of it. You don't need to understand all the minutiae of that particular issue, but you understand what needs to be fixed, right? Or what's wrong, or what's going on here, right? So comedy, I think, is a very effective medium of doing that, and it also expands to this notion. I think one of the disadvantages of what we call legacy media is that at some point it was thought as if journalism only existed in those entities, right? When the landscape of journalism was broader than that. So I think there are people doing journalism in different positions that are not necessarily positions in which you work for a newspaper, right? But you perform that role. And I think in a way social media does that very ineffectively through the influencers, right? In some cases, those influencers really are doing some kind of public service that is closer to what it is journalism, what journalism should be, right? And some people do it with integrity, some people don't, right? So they just are interested in a monetary gain and clickability and getting all the promotional products, right, that come with whatever it is they're doing, right?
Well, podcasting is a form of the new way of broadcast journalism, but it's not on a radio.
Correct.
It's on the internet, but there are some journalists who've gone into that field and freed prisoners who were wrongly incarcerated or have drawn attention. It was podcasts that truly draw attention to the missing Indigenous women.
Yeah. Absolutely, and there are many, and in many cases, because at least initially, a lot of the podcasting really was a work of either a hobby or a love, right? People were devoted about those particular issues, right? And now we have a very sophisticated menu of podcasting. Probably now is excessive, right?
Yeah,
it's hard to get an audience precisely because there are so many. But people who find that particular niche, right, they're able to, and if they do it properly, they just can do wonderful journalism. And I follow a lot of podcasting and a lot of journalists in a podcast format.
I have two questions that came up during conversation. The first is, who decides what the issues are in the political campaign as far as media coverage? Because quite honestly, whether I have friends in Utah or family in Tennessee or family in Texas or family in California, immigration is not in their top 5 issues that are important to them that the President of the United States could have some impact on. But you would think that was all any American voter cared about if you saw any of the news coverage.
I think that's another part of the distortion of the way media operates, right? Journalism, traditionally, at least the way we understand journalism in this legacy media environment, was a journalism that primed powerful sources of information, right? So in reality, the agenda is not really being set by the media, but is set by those in power who are willing to talk to the news writers, right, or the news producers, etc. So it is really the political elite. It is the economic interests also that are involved in this, and it's also other forms of people who have at least credibility or visibility or positions of leadership in society that shape that agenda, and not necessarily the news media themselves, right? So they, in a way, news media responds to that instead of setting the agenda, despite the fact that there are studies, media studies, that claim that journalism really set the agenda, right? And what they claim, and this is one probably a longer discussion because a lot of the media studies really are in this same problem that you are saying. Media studies really emerge, or at least mass communication emerges as a discipline. Is a discipline of persuasion, right? Is persuading people for political purposes or persuading people to buy something.
How does that following the lead of the source of power reconcile with a journalist's desire to tell the truth?
Well, the best definition I've heard was by a reporter from the Boston Globe a long time ago, right? He said, we are in our war, our struggle really is more like a guerrilla warfare. You score one or two stories that you really think they're good, right? But most of the time you're doing stuff that not necessarily passes the muster as a really good journalism, right? So you are there because you still know that it is important, right? And being in that organization makes a difference in what you write, what you publicize, right? But you know that the battle as a whole is lost, right? And that reflects really a dynamic of, because when we talk about, well, there is an impetus for business, right, at the top of the newsroom, and there's an impetus for service on the bottom of the newsroom, which is usually the reporters that want to do that. And what happened is this operates in the newsroom, and in the newsroom occurs a process of socialization, right? Reporters learn by seeing what the reactions are to the stories that they write, right? If their story, that is a very significant story, right, is pushed to page 18, right, or is reduced to 600 words, then they learn that they cannot do that easily, right? And in some cases, I mean, it's very interesting, and probably you've been or you've heard also things in that situation. Sometimes journalists cannot do a story in the news organization they work for. Let's say, for example, I work in a Spanish language operation, and then there's a scandal with a supermarket that is one of the main supporters of that operation, right? So if you're a reporter, you know the structure of power, right, in your newsroom. You know that story is not going to fly, right?
Yeah.
But what you can do is push the story to somebody else who can.
How important is it that newsrooms, that journalists, whether you're in a legacy newsroom environment or you're in a new social media, internet-based environment, how important is it that the reporters and the editors look like their community?
It is essential. I think it is a matter. It's been argued concretely, successfully, and I think with a lot of evidence that newsrooms that reflect their communities, right, they're covered, are more accurate in covering those communities, right? So you cannot have accuracy in the way you cover a particular community if you don't have a newsroom that reflects that diversity of the place that you are located in. Let me give you an example, right? I remember years ago we did a study for, I think it was the Ford Foundation that sponsored that. My mentor was leading that study, and we interviewed a lot of people. I don't remember how many, but it was a lot of people nationwide. So, and in many cases, the examples that we got was, well, we work in these television station, right? And I am the boss, and I am white, right? So I'm the producer, and we have X number of reporters, but we only have one black reporter, right? But if you have only one black reporter and your population is 50% black, you're not going to be able to cover what is needed to reflect the needs and what's happening in that community if only that black reporter is the one that is bringing stories to your newsroom that are related to that segment of the population, right? So you get yourself familiar with something that you're supposed to cover and feel comfortable covering, right? And instead, they always assign journalists of color of that particular group as if they were representatives of that community, which really creates a lot of distortions, right? Because you could be black, but you probably grew up in a different community that is not as segregated as the one that you are covering, right? Or you grew up in a community that was predominantly white, right? So your outlook and your understanding of that community could be as foreign as somebody who is white and has never been exposed to that. So the idea of that newsroom reflecting better the community that they serve is very important in terms of accuracy and comprehensiveness of whatever news organization is supposed to be doing.
Historically, journalists came from the same class as those they covered.
Not necessarily. I think the professionalization of journalism created a separate class, right? I think probably it might be after the emergence of journalism schools, right? That reporters became more like a middle class profession, right? And by the mere fact that they were college educated, right, you create there a barrier to understanding the lives of people who don't have college degrees, right? And they put a lot of distance about issues that matter to working class folks that not necessarily ever went to college.
I think about the anecdote when I grew up on welfare.
Yeah.
And Reagan was my president when I was in high school, and he used his example of the welfare mom who cheat, and she drove around in a gold Cadillac, and she was making money left and right. Well, me and my family, other members of my family, we were all on welfare. I guarantee you there is no way that was possible. And in Los Angeles, I had an aunt who was applying for public assistance because she had children and she'd been divorced, and she couldn't qualify because she had a car. But she had to qualify for public assistance by going to apply and demonstrate she was applying for jobs. Well, she lived in Los Angeles County. How the heck can she apply for a job without a car?
Transportation, yeah.
It made no sense to me. And so I keep thinking of that welfare cheat. We had no food in the refrigerator in the last week of the month. If someone had had that socioeconomic experience, they could have called them on it. Yeah. Simply. Show me. There are always exceptions to the rules. There's that one person who somehow exploits it, but it's not the rule.
Exactly. And I think there is a lot of misunderstanding, right, of the lives of working class people. Barbara Ehrenreich talks about this extensively because she did a lot of reporting on that particular topic. And I think she has a foundation that gives money to support journalism that really is about working class people and not necessarily about other kinds of folks, right? Which is very rare that is done properly.
It seems to me the news media is in a process of evolution because there's still a hunger for community news. I still want to see that story about my high school son who hit the home run and scored and won the game and won the title for my school. I still want to see that in the paper. I still want to know why the freeway was shut down for 4 hours last night. What happens to that type of coverage? I mean, I have to rely on Neighborhood or whatever the hell it's called, Next Door. I think it's called. I always get that thing wrong. Next Door or something like that.
Next Door is becoming problematic, right? Because there are a lot of issues with platforms. And Next Door. When Next Door came in, I thought about that because I thought, well, there was an emergence media model that spoke to hyperlocal news.
Yeah.
And I think the efforts to do local news is a pretty hard endeavor. And that's where most of the crisis of journalism really has affected, right? Mm-hmm. What is been lost also, and I think that's very significant, and I suspect maybe that will be covered by nonprofit news, is the coverage of local politics, which I think are the most important aspect of it. It's not sexy, it's not attractive, right? In a lot of places, and in the past, we used to thought about that as the first step for a student, their first job, right? Covering the city council, etc.
You worked your way up to it. You were a night GA, and if you got lucky, you get a city council afterwards.
So I don't think the model that was there before was good either, because I think young reporters sometimes couldn't understand the political dynamics that they were seeing, right? And it takes a while to understand them and to understand the implications. And it takes you to live in that area to really understand what is happening, right? Mm-hmm. And who are the players, etc. So I don't think it was properly done, but now I think it's the total disaster, and it's now not even covered, right, properly. So I don't have an answer for that. But I suspect it has to be a nonprofit model that can be more responsive to the needs of the community and not to the needs of a particular group in the community or a particular economic or political interest inside the community, right?
We see a couple of those nonprofit models here in California, and I cannot speak to the fortunes of CalMatters or EdSource, but the LAS just downsized a little bit, and they're a nonprofit model, but as someone who works in higher education, I find the coverage from EdSource and CalMatters invaluable, because no one was. The legacy newsrooms have gotten so small. There is no way one individual or two individuals can cover the educational issues that are important to California citizens or just to Southern California citizens. I mean, there are so many colleges and universities. There are so many K through 12 schools and school districts that 2-3 people you cannot fairly request them to cover those important issues. And then if you throw on state politics and you throw on county politics and regional politics, they'd never sleep.
I think the model hasn't really been found, right? Like in the case of the transition of newspapers to new media, I think the only successful story is the New York Times.
Yeah.
And the New York Times was able to do that because it went to a large scale, right? Remember in the old days in the newspaper business, they said the real power is really in the circulation manager, right?
Yeah.
Because whatever is done, if it is not delivered, right, it's a big logistical issue, right? I mean, think about the operation that you need to have to deliver a newspaper like the LA Times, for example, in a metro area of this size, right? So
9 million plus people.
So logistically, is a really complex issue. Now, internet broke that model completely, right? But then you don't get the same kind of revenue for what you were delivering in paper to a home, right? Now is much less money for that, so you need to scale to a larger group of viewers or readers or whatever, right? So, and when you do that, you lose a lot of the sight of the local.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And even the New York Times, I mean, I've been following this year because it's an electoral year. I've been following the New York Times. I hate the paper. I get mad at the paper all the time. And they steal the local news for New York is so weak, right?
Yes, no kidding.
Is so weak
Yeah.
that is amazing, really, that they have New York in their mascot or in their title, right? I think it's very, very weak, and I can see a lot of holes that they need to be probably filled out by other news organizations that are operating in that large city, right?
It's the way LA's publications rely on city news service to fill the holes of local coverage.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think a lot of those. It might be not that there's not a successful model, right? But maybe a successful set of models to cover important things that are relevant locally, right? To communities that live in this city and they don't live in the global world, right? That most of the digital media are engaged with.
But to go back to the idea of journalism, our founding fathers found it so important they singled it out in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Why is it still so important?
Oh, because you need the consent of the citizenship to govern it, right? Mm-hmm. So if people are not persuaded that you are a legitimate government, right, it will be chaos, or it will be a revolution, or it could be an uprising, or it could be whatever. You need people who live in the community to at least agree to the most basic tenets of the status quo, right? Mm-hmm. What is being very interesting, and probably this is not effect of social media or media in general, but an economic model that now primes itself as being global, right, and not necessarily as being national. You see the emergence of a lot of disconnect between the people that are governing versus the people that are governed. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of erosion of that, and I think that erosion is also an erosion of lacking that kind of media system that made this governing group legitimate to the eyes of the public, right? Because there's no way that can be conveyed to the citizenship because you have such fragmented media landscape, right?
But do you think journalists will find their way again?
I do believe. I mean, at the bottom, I'm always an optimistic guy. So I think you see the same in the same way that you describe why you went into journalism, right? Mm-hmm. You see a lot of people devoted still to the ideals of journalism, right? Mm-hmm. And I think people who understand the significance of providing accurate information, and sometimes information that people in power don't want to see, right, published or publicized, is a very significant drive for many people.
Well, let's put it this way. During the pandemic, you had essential workers still working, and among those were journalists.
Absolutely, right? And journalists, I think that speaks to the importance of that. But I go back to this idea because the media landscape is so fragmented mm-hmm. now. So there's a big disconnect. And that's why you see a lot of people hate journalists, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people now express really unambiguous, hateful sentiments about journalists as if they were, I don't know, the evildoers, right, of society. When Donald Trump came into power, they invited me to an SPJ panel, and there was a journalist there. And I was a little bit of a dissenting voice. One, because I was not practicing journalism, right? I'm in academia, so I could be a little bit more critical. But one of the things that I mentioned at the time, and I've been thinking about this all along, is you need to look at the way in which media and journalists were attacked in emerging authoritarian systems like the Nazi system to understand what was happening today, right? So if you want to understand what happened during 2016 and still is going on, you can go back and read what happened in Germany in the 1930s that mm-hmm. made possible for Hitler to come to power mm-hmm. and to understand that destroying journalists, right? And destroying the credibility of journalism was essential for that kind of authoritarian system to emerge.
You're a professor of journalism. What do you tell your students?
Man, that's a tough question. But I think in the case of teaching, especially teaching young people, right, that come with aspirations of doing journalism in the same way that you expressed it at the beginning, right? They want to do a service to the community. They know the importance of doing journalism because they want to serve the community. First, I don't want to crush that sense, right? I want to reinforce that sense that real journalism is exactly that, right? It's serving, is information, is for service to the communities, primarily an occupation that is of service and not of business, right? Mm-hmm. And not of propaganda, etc. But I think we've been late to try to, and I will be guilty of that as well, to help our students, especially students who are interested in covering general news, right, or politics, which are not that many, right, as you probably know. So in sort of educating them about the potential dangers of the profession in the near future, right, and how they should respond to that, or how they can protect themselves against that.
I think about that, and I think about the unsettling in legacy media as it's trying to find its new footing. But I also think about the emergence of podcasts. Mm-hmm. And they can shoot the messenger like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the LA Times. But there are hundreds of podcasts around the world. How do you shoot that messenger?
Correct. You cannot. And I think that's one of the significant aspects of the internet today, right?
Yeah.
Think about the coverage of Gaza, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't know as much about what's going on in Gaza if it wouldn't be for the internet.
Yeah. The citizen journalist in many ways.
Because it's what people are communicating, right, of what's going on there, because there's a complete blockade of journalists being there, right? Mm-hmm. So foreign journalists cannot be in Gaza unless they are approved by the Israeli government, and they haven't approved anybody. So there's a blockade of information, right? And despite the fact that there is a powerful interest in suppressing that information, we have information thanks to the internet, right?
In Russia, where things are so oppressed,
absolutely, yeah,
we're still getting information. Information is still getting out about what is happening in Russia, and it's shared through my cell phone. Mm-hmm. Journalists will find a way to tell stories. Not fiction, but tell the stories of other people.
Correct. And now that you mentioned that example, right, that you were talking about, you were able to see stuff. A lot of what's happening also in journalism is, we never thought about this before, but there are collectives of journalists, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of that, I think it might grow in the future as people on their own won't be able to succeed alone, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of the power of the collective entities and maybe a co-op system, right, that also will allow journalists to work together in stories that are relevant to several communities, right? Could be.
And I think of some of the reporters in Europe who've been murdered, who were covering stories, Mexico, mm-hmm. Central America, they were alone in many ways. They were the one person. But these collectives, you pick off one journalist, the story is not dead.
Correct.
It's still going to be told. Mm-hmm. But you've now added to the story because you've got the extra story. What is it they don't want you to know because they've killed this person? And every one of those instances, the story they wanted to suppress gets told.
Well, those are the reasons that I think we should be optimistic, right, about journalism really surviving the crisis, because I think there's still impetus and need for getting information out to the public, right? As long as we don't live in a completely totalitarian society, we still have people who will be willing to do it. In a way, what we are in crisis to is a crisis of creativity in the way in which information is presented, right? I think in a way, the formats of the legacy media became irrelevant in this new environment, right? But I think we need to wrestle with that.
But at the same time, we got to figure out how to tell those stories now. We have an election in November.
Well, that's true. And I think it's a very important election, right? And I think that the way the election has been shaping after the debate, after the first debate, is very discouraging, right? And I think many people probably are bracing for 4 more years of Donald Trump, right? Coming our way. So that would be a big challenge for journalism and for news organizations if Donald Trump is elected to the presidency, right?
It makes the coming years of being a journalist interesting.
Well, it's a challenge, right? And you see, I mean, the same way that I was telling you the example of Germany in the 30s, right? You see the way in which, especially the journalists in Munich, which is the place where most of the early struggle of the Nazi regime really happened, did, right? And how they were heroic until they couldn't be more heroic, right? They were gotten rid of. So maybe it's a big challenge, especially for independent news organizations, right? Not organizations that will just bend to whatever power.
If it's challenging, we are going to need more young.
It will be more needed than at any other time in the history of this country, right? And
we'll need young ones because they'll know how to.
Correct.
Social media and then the internet. They'll know how to do that.
Correct. And I think it has to be in places that are not the usual places that you will see journalism emerging, right? I don't see larger news organizations challenging a new Trump presidency.
I don't know how to lead you to a positive environment now.
Well, the positive thing is that, as we were saying, right, journalism will survive, right? Journalism will still be there in spite of the odds. It will be there. Journalists
have always been there. Since the dawn of time, someone's been on cave walls or painting what happened in society. So I assume.
Yeah, that is, it's an impetus of communicating something important, right, to others. And I think that journalism is at the core of that, right, of researching, asking questions, and communicating that information to the public is still of a lot of value in any society, right? Regardless of how difficult it is to do it.
Thank you for joining us for Diving Into the Discourse. You can watch and listen to more of our podcasts on the CSUN Conversations website and become part of the CSUN Conversations community.